Hello everyone, and welcome back to the Beatles Forever. In our last episode, Mal seemed just as busy as he was when the Beatles toured. He joined Paul in America, and then he and Paul returned to the studio and began working on two projects, Magical Mystery Tour and Yellow Submarine. Mal also had a bit of trouble when a girl he had been pen pals with appeared on his door a day early, and she got to meet his wife. Oh boy, so I bet Mal heard an earful from his wife that night. So let's see what's going on today. On May 19th, Brian Epstein had a press launch for Sgt. Pepper at his Chapel Street home. The Beatles had been out of the public eye, and now they had the release of Strawberry Fields Forever / Penny Lane. It was a single. It was kind of like a coming out party. John Lennon walked into the room first, and NME's Norrie Drummond wrote, and then came George Harrison and Paul McCartney, followed by Ringo Starr and road managers Neil Aspinall and Mal Evans. The Beatles had arrived at a small dinner party in Brian Epstein's Belgravia home to talk to journalists and disc jockeys for the first time in many months. One of the guests that evening was Linda Eastman, who had first met Paul McCartney 4 nights earlier at the Bag, where Georgie Fame and the Blue Flames were topping the bill. Linda later remembered that they flirted a little bit before heading out to yet another club, the Speakeasy, where they heard Procol Harum's A Wider Shade of Pale for the first time. They ended the evening at 7 Cavendish Avenue, where Linda recalled being impressed to see her future husband's prize trio of Magritte paintings. Later that month, Brian threw a housewarming party at Kinsley Hill, his Sussex County country home. Mal and Neil were very late getting there. They had dropped acid on the drive there and got lost on the rural back roads. They drove around for hours, and they didn't get there to Kingsley Hill until 6 a.m. Neil remembered that they stopped at a rural police station to ask for directions. Mal started to study a road map on the walls of the station, and he was in an acid haze, and the highways and byways depicted there began to take on surreal colors. He just kept staring at the map saying, "Oh wow, man," over and over, as Neil steered him away so they could find Brian's home. The Beatles, John especially, the housewarming party offered the opportunity for an acid-drenched weekend in the country. By this point, he loved Owsley White Lightning, even going so far as to arrange for his own regular supplier to smuggle the drug into the United Kingdom in film canisters. The next day, with Mal's family along, the festivities continued in Weybridge, with the Evanses shuttling between Lennon's Kenwood estate and Sunny Heights, the Starkeys' abundant spread at the bottom of St. George's Hill. Mal never got tired of going to Ringo's house, which featured its own mirrored pub, the Flying Cow, a private cinema, and 9 immaculately terraced acres, including a waterfall, a go-kart track, a koi pond, and a secret garden highlighted by a hedgerow maze. Gary thought it was a magical experience. When he wasn't climbing up the treehouse at Sunny Heights or goofing around with Ringo, who took movie footages of him playing the guitar, the boy spent hours playing with 4-year-old Julian Lennon at Kenwood, where, like his father, he had grown especially fond of John's above-ground swimming pool. Gary took special pleasure playing with the Lennon's cat that was named Mal. John had good-naturedly named it after you-know-who. As for John, he spent most of the time in bed, according to Mal's diary, no doubt floored by his latest shipment of White Lightning. By the time Mal drove the family back to Liverpool at the end of May, Mal started to feel sick. It turned out he had the measles. Mal raced home to Liverpool in his Humber Super Snipe. Next, Gary got the measles, and he later remembered, "Mom and Dad got me a kid doctor set with a plastic syringe and a stethoscope, all in a white plastic carrying case." Seemed like I had one of those when I was about that age. While he was recuperating at Hillside Road, Mal received a typewritten condolence letter from John, in which the Beatle adopted the Joycean style like his best-selling books, which were in his own right and a Spaniard in the works. John wrote, Dear Mal, I was stupid to hear it of your grave dilemma, such bad measles. I'm hoping this adult setback, this omnipresence in your good body, has not impaired you. However black the clouds may be, they're not as black as me. In truth, we are surely flappered by your absence, and all your mighty beams will be directed toward those spots. Fortunately, is the end of a long line of fingers from your ever-loving pal in question, J.F. Lepper. Yours in a chunky Highland cedar, John. And then it had X's at the bottom. The letter ended it with a cryptic post-note, and love, of course, to Lil, Gary, and some other children you seem to have. By the time Mal recovered and made his return to London, Neil and the band were caught up in the fervor associated with the Beatles' upcoming appearance on Our World, an international television simulcast slated for June 25th. The show was 10 months in the making. It was the brainchild of BBC producer Aubrey Singer. The Beatles waited until 4 weeks before the show to settle on a song, and they would perform it live in front of hundreds of millions of viewers. They selected John's All You Need Is Love. George Martin insisted that the band pre-record a backing track to avoid any last-minute problems. "We are going to hedge our bets," he told the group. "When we go on the air, I'll play you the rhythm track, which you'll pretend to be playing. But your voices and the orchestra will really be live, and we'll mix the whole thing together and transmit it to the waiting world like that." On June 14th, the Beatles assembled at Olympic Studios in Barnes to make their first attempt at recording All You Need Is Love, with John and his mates working out the song structure in real time. Mal mapped out the head arrangement for the song in his notebook, and on the Friday before the simulcast, Brian Epstein interrupted their rehearsal to recommend that they release All You Need Is Love and on the back Baby You're a Rich Man as their next single, both to take advantage of Our World status as a truly global event and to cash in on what could be the greatest and most visible pop song debut in the history of the record business. George Martin's fears happened on the telecast of Sunday, June 25th. There was a technical glitch. George Martin was smart to prepare for any problems, and just moments before the broadcast, he learned that Our World's producer had lost all contact with the studio. Martin later recalled, "I was on the verge of hysterical laughter. I remember thinking, if we're going to do something wrong, we might as well do it in style in front of 200 million people." To Mal and the band's great relief, All You Need Is Love proved to be a triumph, with the single shortly taking its place atop the UK charts. Strawberry Fields Forever, back with Penny Lane, had been an anomaly. The role that they had had before roared back into life. The Beatles went on hiatus from the recording studio after completing All You Need Is Love, and their hiatus would last 2 months. They weren't idle during this period. That July, as Sgt. Pepper became the soundtrack for the Summer of Love, the Beatles embarked on a most unusual summer of their own making. John took the lead in his acid-washed state. The boys had decided to establish their own hippie commune on an island in the Aegean Sea. As Neil later remembered, the idea that you'd have 4 houses with tunnels connecting them to a central dome. Naturally, there would also be an accommodation for Mal and Neil. On July 22nd, the group, which included John, Cynthia, and Julian, Paul and Jane, George, Patty, and her younger sister Paula, rounded out by Ringo, Mal, Neil, and Alistair Taylor. They left London for Athens. Lily and the children had been invited to join them, but they had to bow out because their passports weren't in order. Brian missed the trip because of the recent death of his father, Harry, for whom the Beatles' manager was sitting Shiva. The trip would prove a relatively short advance for Neil and Ringo, the latter of whom was eager to return to be with Maureen, who was expecting their second child. In Athens, the group was taken around the city by Alexis Mardas, a former TV repairman come crackpot inventor who had wriggled his way into John's good graces with an outrageous promises of such technological wizardry as a secret substance he would deploy to erect a force field around their homes, wallpaper sneakers, and other dubious electronic gadgetry. And with Magic Alex, as John had dubbed him, there would always be the promise of more to come. With Neil and Ringo still in tow, Magic Alex led the Beatles and their entourage on a guided tour of the countryside. Mal recalled traveling in a convoy of cars, a big Mercedes and a couple of huge old American taxis, headed for the beach. For 3 hours we drove through the countryside in the pleasant hot sunshine, until suddenly we realized that the taxi carrying Paul, Jane, and Neil was not following. The extreme heat had been too much for their car, and turning back, we found them surrounding the taxi with thick black smoke pouring out of the engine, which all but caught fire. Mal couldn't help noticing that the Greek tourist board always seemed to be one step ahead of us, thanks to Magic Alex, who had been tipping off its compatriots about the Beatles' presence. 2 musicians, flute and guitar players, entertained us after lunch, Mal remembered, with everyone dancing. Ringo with such wild abandon, cutting his ankle. When they reached the seaside, Mal took a swim, which left him with a thorn in his foot. And there was a comic moment when Paul and Neil helped Mal's legs, while Jane attempted to remove the thorn. The hilarity emerged when it became apparent that it was Neil's foot to which Jane was tending, all the while wondering why Mal didn't flinch. The group rounded out the afternoon with a shopping trip in which Ringo, still smarting from his injured ankle, attempted to outmaneuver the crowds by waiting until they followed John and the rest of the group into one shop, and then exploring another all by his lonesome. Eventually, Ringo's plan backfired, and he was caught on his own with dozens of photographers and a large number of American visitors surrounding him. Overhearing one of them say, isn't it crazy we travel all the way from Chicago and find Ringo in a Greek shoe shop?" A few days later, the band and their entourage began going around the Aegean in a hired yacht, the MV Arrive, searching for the Beatles' island utopia. The luxurious boat featured 24 berths, an 8-person crew, along with a chef and 2 stewards. Thanks to Magic Alex, a large crowd gathered on the dock at sunset to bid the group farewell. Mal said that night, it being so warm, I slept on the upper deck of the boat next to John, the 2 of us talking and enjoying the night air before sleep was to overcome us. Mal reveled in the warm, wonderful days with George playing a banjo that I had taken with me and which he had previously painted, with a large face on the skin and the Hare Krishna mantra on the back. The whole experience was dreamlike. The white foam rushing from the bow down to either side of the ship, the hazy mountains in the distance, all of us sitting up front chanting the mantra. The Greek mountains seemed to have no past and no future as we sailed by, only an eternal presence. Evenings spent looking for flying saucers amongst the cold, icy points that glittered in the sky. When they finally arrived at their destination, the Agos Island, it was 300,000 square meters, and the boys discovered a rocky expanse occupied by what seemed to be 1,000,000 crickets. If they were disappointed, it didn't matter, because John and George had spent most of the journey tripping on acid, courtesy of Mal's dope bag. Mal, though, he clearly enjoyed the holiday in the Aegean. He was in its beautiful clear waters every chance he got. George and Patty departed Greece on July 29th. They had an American trip to go on. And John and Paul insisted that Mal join the couple on the return flight to England and bring back Lil and his children to share in their Aegean adventure. But before Mal could make the return trip to Greece with his family, John and Paul had flown back to England. Despite having doubts about whether they could inhabit the Aegeus, the boys instructed Alistair to make the purchase anyway, earning a modest profit when they flipped the property a few months later. John didn't want to disappoint Lil and the children, so he invited the Evans family to spend a few weeks at his home in Weybridge. While they were there, Lily's father, William White, died from a heart attack at the age of 67. Over the past few years, Mal had shared with her how intimidating John could be, so Lil was surprised when the Beatle brought her a cup of tea, let down his guard, and showered her with consolation. Like Mal, Lily would always remember John's tender gesture. "It's very hard at times like these to give verbal comfort to anybody," Mal wrote, "but John was fantastic, and I knew that he gave Lil a lot of comfort in her hour of need, something I have always blessed him for." Shortly afterward, Mal and his family made their sad return to Liverpool, where we were to receive a most beautiful letter from Brian Epstein, offering his condolences and sympathy. August passed by in a hush, with Mal sticking close to Liverpool for a change, and Lily navigating her life in the wake of her father's death. Together, the Evans family returned to London toward the end of the month. On August 22nd, the band had begun working on Your Mother Should Know, a tune that Paul had written for the television special. The session was held that night at London's Chapel recording studios. Mal was on hand, of course, and the boys enjoyed a rare visit from Brian Epstein, who was still grieving over the loss of his father. So I will end the video here. It was another busy time for the Beatles and their entourage. They had press parties, appeared on a live TV performance, and then they took 2 months off and ended up going to Greece. Mal had the time of his life swimming in the sea and traveling in a yacht with the Beatles. Mal and John were close in this episode, and John wrote Mal a letter when he had the measles, and he also showed a tender side when Lil's father died. So it was kind of neat to be able to travel along with the Beatles with their Greek adventure. Well, I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you haven't subscribed, if you could do so, it would help the channel to grow, as well as giving it a thumbs up. It's all a great help. And if you haven't clicked on the notification bell, if you could do that, it lets you know when a video is posted. More importantly, I want to wish everyone a good day, and tune in again soon for another episode of The Beatles Forever. Thank you. Bye.